All right, guys, so Microsoft's recently come out with an article where they pitch a hypothetical roadmap where passwords are no longer supported. And you may be watching this thinking, Nick, not another end of passwords video. We've heard it for years, nothing's changed. If anything, the only thing that we've looked at recently is the NIST publication around the fact that users shouldn't change their passwords because that's actually more secure due to insecure user behavior in the passwords that they select. But hear me out. In this video, we're actually going to go through some of the recent security data around passwords and identity attacks that might be actually quite alarming for Microsoft's Digital Defense Report, along with some of the new UX research they've been conducting around nudging people into passwordless forms of authentication that we'll dive into as well, that might actually influence this in a faster timeline than we would think. Okay guys, so what we're taking a look at here is Microsoft's Digital Defense Report from 2024. They came out with this at the end of last year. And if you haven't read this yet, I definitely would check it out. I'll link it in the blog post that I supplement these videos with. You can find in the video description. A lot of great security data you can use to share with your customers and help educate them on the current landscape and why you're doing some of the things you're doing or asking of them from a security perspective. I just want to take a look at this slide though. This infographic is one of the most glaring ones to me as far as importance, and was also one of the most eye-opening as far as understanding the diversity here of the attacks. And I just want this to sink in for a second because we're talking here about identity attacks and 99% of those identity attacks being still password attacks to this day. When we think about this, I think a lot of our awareness and attention is being diverted into these more sophisticated attacks like token theft and adversary in the middle attacks because they are growing so rapidly, but they're also more complicated to execute because they can bypass even MFA if it's enabled on an account. But it's important to keep this in perspective of this glaring problem that's still, the majority of users that are getting compromised out there today. And when we take a look at some of these other statistics, we see that, 7,000 password attacks are blocked per second over the past year from Microsoft. If you've been following along with this, I have. It's compounded significantly even in the past year and a half. We've seen it go from 2,000 to 4,000 to 7,000 now. And I don't know that that's going to slow down. And the other thing, like I said, there's a lot of eye candy, if you will, out there for these other attacks that you don't want to discredit because they are growing significantly, like token theft. And they show in here it's estimated 39,000 per day of these incidents for token theft. And also we see 146% rise in the adversary in the middle phishing attacks as well too. So definitely still something that's growing rapidly you want to pay attention to and put in protections for. But this broader perspective here also gives us clarity into why might we go on to a passwordless journey sooner rather than later. The other big part of this report that I wanted to call out here is just this MFA adoption infographic, which was also pretty alarming and surprising to see as well. Personally, I would have thought this would be in a much higher percentage, especially given the past few years with some of these things that Microsoft's done to have MFA as more of a hard default enforcement on tenants. We explicitly have to go turn things off to have MFA off for your user accounts. But we can see here that MFA percentage adoption for Entra ID monthly active users signing in is only at 41%, which is really wild to see. I would have thought that would have been more of a 70% at this point in time, especially given the policies that Microsoft's driven. But I believe that passwords will probably follow under a similar timetable as far as some of these strict requirements, or even things like following NIST standards for making passwords not change by default as an example of that, that we'll see as time continues to go on here. But this is another glaring one that, again, is kind of your core basics, right? If you have a client that doesn't have MFA and they're refusing to adopt MFA, it's probably a client you shouldn't have, right? It's probably a client you should look at firing because they don't understand the importance of security, and you don't want to be on the other side of that risk. So with this in mind, let's take a look at some of the UX research Microsoft's been doing around passwordless forms of authentication and understand the adoption there. quick sidebar, guys. If you're enjoying this video on passwords and identity security, be sure to check out a tool that I built called Cloud Capsule. You can get a link in the description, cloudcapsule.io, which runs a security assessment across your Microsoft 365 tenant in just minutes. And this will include a lot of the security data that we are going over, not only in this episode from the standpoint of MFA, passwords, things like that, but it spans across every facet of Microsoft, including email, devices, domain health, everything like that you can get in a single report. So be sure to check this out. You can run a free assessment on your tenant by going to cloudcapsule.io and clicking on this free trial button. Okay, so this is the article that actually referenced from the beginning of this video where I was citing this hypothetical roadmap of passwords no longer being supported. And this is something obviously just a loose type of model based off of really kind of peeling in the security data that we're seeing here. And this is just from a couple of product managers over at Microsoft. But the big thing here as part of this article, which is titled Convincing a Billion Users to Love Passkeys, is around some UX design research they've been doing to boost adoption of passkeys and get people away from using passwords. So it's interesting data no matter what. Not sure of the data size, but they actually quote some of this information that was in the Digital Defense Report. And effectively here, they did a test case against both consumer grade accounts, people signing into a Microsoft Live type of a login, which is more personal, right? Versus a business account with Microsoft 365 or Copilot. And so with this, we see some interesting statistics here that they pulled. And I think there's some asterisks to these, but I want to go through these first, which relates to the speed concepts here of having a passkey having that, from a flow perspective, being 3 times faster than using a traditional password and 8 times faster than password and traditional multi-factor authentication. I'm guessing they're using the audit logs within Microsoft to be able to test that. It'd be harder to see, just from maybe just monitoring people and things like that. 3 times more successful signing of passkeys versus passwords. This was a pretty big variance. I don't know. Again, this is why I would love to see more of the underlying metadata that made this up here to understand these statistics a little bit more. But that's a pretty big disparity, obviously, of what we're looking at. And this is a really high completion rate, which is 99% of users who started the passkey registration flow complete it. And, with these screenshots, it makes me think that they definitely were leveraging this on more of the consumer grade accounts and the applications that they were leveraging there. And some of this you've seen on like GitHub if you use a GitHub account. And it's really easy to set up, a passkey with those because it's usually in most cases trying to tie to your Windows device. And it's a really simplistic setup to be able to configure and do on a Windows device if you've had that. I'm not as personally familiar with Macs, but I would assume it's not too big of a variance in that regard. But some of these other statistics that they came in here, was around Windows Nudge users, which organic context makes a lot of sense versus user manually going into their account settings and setting it up that way, which has traditionally been beyond Windows Hello for Business as far as establishing a passwordless method. That's part of the passwordless framework there. Been, traditionally how people have set up passkeys in the past, like a security key, as an example, YubiKey has been manually set up that way. Some of the language or verbiage that they use versus more secure versus faster, a couple percentage difference here for speed as related to that. And then giving users the ability to kind of skip over for that as well too. So it's been interesting, to go through this as an exercise. And when they cited in here, the other statistic they used is the initial launch saw a 10% drop in password use and 987% increase in passkey use. So I think certainly some of these stats are probably inflated due to if you looked at the underlying data and said, there's some asterisks there. But I still think it's an interesting study just to be able to kind of go through this and to think about this type of a journey, because the dual benefit here is that if you get users to support a passkey, not just a passwordless authentication method with maybe Authenticator, then you also get into phishing resistant credentials, that can be leveraged, and that would help block attacks like the adversary in the middle that's risen, that 146% that we saw in the past. But I think it's important to recognize, we've seen a lack of adoption for multiple reasons, obviously, in the past. Just one, first and foremost, there's a fundamental resistance to change when it comes to this infamiliarity with this new technology versus, I don't know, I use a password. I've used it for years and it's in our existing systems. I think another constraint is obviously hybrid environments where we have passwords that still need to be supported on legacy systems, and that's hard to navigate if you're running a hybrid environment. And then obviously one of the big things is just that friction. So obviously YubiKeys create not only a new form of being able to sign in, but they could be lost. In some cases, they're a little bit harder to understand for the regular user than just signing in with their credentials there. So there's those considerations there, but I wanted to take a look, at least as we kind of look at passkeys in general, a couple different ways of the user experience of signing in. But more recently, Microsoft's come out with a new form of a passkey that's tied into Microsoft Authenticator that you can set up, that I wanted to show you that user experience of actually that configuration, as well as their sign-in experience too, because I think it's interesting to think about that as we fundamentally try to grasp what adoption might look like here. Okay, so there's a couple different methods a user can register a passkey. The most recent update is around downloading Microsoft Authenticator and having the user sign in or use their existing profile on Authenticator to be able to create a new passkey that they can leverage. And you'll see me here signing in with my Microsoft account. In this case, I'm also showcasing, entering a temporary access pass as part of this flow, given if you were onboarding a net new user, you would want to leverage temporary access pass if you had a passwordless environment so that they could sign in and fulfill kind of a multi-factor flow all at once, and then be able to establish this passkey like you're seeing here. And they get some messaging here around these types of methods that they can create. And then we're going through and we're actually creating this passkey as part of their experience. And it's also registering this passwordless sign-in. So they can use this if they're signing into Office applications or in a browser through Office apps in their 365 account. They can do so now with that particular passkey. And if you look in here, you can see here that I have that passkey registered. And this is also the area where somebody would be able to create one if they had not already, or if they weren't, a new time user going within there. The other sections here also outline, this is how you can leverage this. It gives them a little short tutorial on this. And the quick call out is that Bluetooth has to be enabled on both devices that they're going to sign in with. So let's take a look at the user's sign-in experience now with this passkey. Okay, so I'm going to try to go ahead and sign in here with an account. I'm going to click on next. And it's going to go ahead and try to default sign me in with my Windows Hello with a different form of passkey that I'm going to avoid for right now. I've got all the passkeys in here, as far as the YubiKey, Windows Hello, which I'll show here in a minute. And then I have the iPhone, iPad, or Android device. This is what they would see if they were going to connect via that method that we just set up on Microsoft Authenticator. So I'll go ahead and click on next here. And this is where that user experience gets a little clunky because they get this QR code that they need to scan. And I'll show here on the cell phone them going through that experience as well. They'll get prompted here to sign in with this passkey, and then it's going to authenticate them. Also, you will notice that it uses the biometric there for the sign-in, which is actually a really nice other method of security. And then, from there, they're able to go ahead and get signed in. Now, the big thing there with that one is that it is, like you mentioned, a little bit more clunky from the end user experience of having to scan that QR code, opening a camera, versus if they are already on the Microsoft Authenticator app, they get that prompt, to type in a number today as part of that experience. So it's just a little bit more clunky to do that. But let me go ahead actually and just sign out here again. And I'm going to go ahead and sign in now. I can't show, or won't be showing the full user experience of setting up Windows Hello for Business, But if you're issuing a new workstation and you have Windows Hello for Business configured either via Intune or whatnot for the user to set up, it's actually the most preferred method, because then they can use this passkey that's tied to their device, and I can just use the face imprint or face scan that's used on my piece of hardware here, which is just the Surface PC. Could be any type of PC though. And then I can click on OK, and I'm right within there. So that to me is a much better user experience, just because it's a little bit more native, because that's what we do typically on our iPhones and mobile phones and things like that as well. So it's a lot easier for the user to kind of comprehend that flow versus getting into, a lot of these other experiences here that tie into a little bit more clunky user experience. So all in all, with those experiences, I do believe personally that the end user experience as well as the admin flow is going to have to evolve a little bit more in order to see more adoption, for passkeys, just given that number one constraint being resistance to change and a lot of those factors. But I do think there's going to be a lot more pressure, much like what we've seen with Microsoft's aggressiveness towards pursuing more heavy enforcements for MFA, just because of the rising security concern. But I do believe passkeys are likely the best user option, given it's something that we can leverage natively from a lost or stolen device perspective. It gets a little bit clunky from that perspective as well, but not necessarily more so if it's on Microsoft Authenticator than if somebody lost their phone today and they're using that for number matching as an example. So I think there's still going to be more time before we see some more aggressive tactics behind this, but certainly like the way that this is trending and what Microsoft's looking at in the sense of driving this type of user research and adoption for passkeys. And ideally, we continue to see that become easier and easier to use over time. Okay, guys, that's everything I had for you today. Definitely comment below with your prediction on a passwordless future and timelines around that, if any. And comment with any questions that you had about the content that I covered here today. If you like this content, want to see more about Microsoft and the MSP space, be sure to subscribe. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next week.